do you think of when you hear the word banjo? Country music, bluegrass, the sweet old hillbilly lifestyle? It's all understandable, but if you think the banjo's an American creation, think again. Its roots can actually be traced all the way back to sub-Saharan West Africa, and for a big portion of its history, the banjo was an instrument played by black people. So let's talk about it. Although the banjo is now a quintessential instrument in the American folk music genre, it was actually developed ages ago by enslaved Africans in North American and Caribbean colonies. And further than that, West Africans used similar stringed instruments to make music. In fact, the banjo shares design elements and playing techniques with a family of about 80 West African lutes. You see, the Atlantic slave trade plucked millions of African people with different cultures, languages, and religions from their homelands and dumped them together into unknown terrain. As a result, many of them had to find ways to communicate with each other, and one of the best ways was through music. So, using materials they could find, enslaved folks in the Americas began crafting different versions of instruments they played back home, and what came out of that forced synchronization of African cultures was the early banjo. Some of the earliest banjos discovered in Haiti date back to the early 1600s, and at the time, they were played exclusively by enslaved folks because to the white eye, they were seen as primitive instruments. When really, it was far from being so. The banjo was born out of a will and a want to survive. It was a way for people of different cultures to come together and find strength through music. Thus, the banjar, as it was called back then, made its way out of the Caribbean across the Americas and became a part of many enslaved communities. In fact, it became so synonymous with enslaved folks that notices for escaped slaves specifically mentioned their banjo playing abilities, and parties at southern plantations forced enslaved folks to play instruments of African origin. And after slavery, the banjo became a symbol of African American artistry, from calypso music in Trinidad and Tobago to mento music in Jamaica or jazz in the American South. This stringed instrument was predominant in black communities and music. So how did the banjo go from being an integral part of black history, an instrument quite exclusively played by black folks, to becoming closely associated with a white rural style of music? Well, this shift began in the 19th century thanks to minstrel shows. Through blackface, anti-black caricatural skits, and racist satire, white performers started using the banjo in minstrel shows as a way to mock black culture. And while non-slave owning mountain musicians did also learn how to play the banjo from black banjo players that lived in the Appalachians, minstrel shows are what really brought the instrument into white American mainstream culture. And so, due to the popularity of minstrel shows, banjos became a must-have, and because they became a must-have, they also became mass-produced as a way to meet demand. So, by the early 20th century, banjos were found in many American households regardless of race, and their black history was all but forgotten. Media campaigns promoted the idea of banjo players being white, and when folk music had a revival in the 1950s, the banjo came to be firmly seen as a sort of white rural art form, something that has stuck till today. But to black folk artists, the banjo's history isn't entirely forgotten, and to me, it stands as just another example of the resilience, creativity, and influence of black culture.